So before we get started, I'd love to just take a quick poll, and I like to do this anywhere I go, but who here has used Uber before? All right, keep your hands up for a second. All right, look around at the folks who don't have their hands raised and shame them. And anybody needs a promo code for a free ride afterward, come find me and we'll make sure to make that happen. So I was talking to some people on my team yesterday. We have local operations teams across major markets, and I oversee several states, the most important of which is Texas, given that I'm from Texas. But I was talking to a couple people on our Houston team, which is where I'm based, and they said, "Where are you speaking?" And I said, it's the HetNet Forum. It's related to the Wireless Industry Association. And Alex, one of the guys on my team, said, "Well, what do you really have in common with this group of folks? Like, what are you going to talk about that's relevant?" And I said, "Well, let's see. We're building a network across cities, counties, states, and countries, and the more reliable it gets, the more people expect it to be perfect all the time. I wonder what we could have in common with these folks." So, nice segue to our mission statement, which is transportation as reliable as running water, everywhere, for everyone. The challenge with that audacious goal is that the more reliable you get, the more people expect it to be perfect. Nobody calls their water utility or the electric grid and says, "Thanks for making sure the water was running this morning or the lights came on." And similarly, nobody calls the folks at your companies to do that. Now, I'd like to blame millennials for this problem, but the fact of the matter is this has been true as long as we've had services that are broadly available to the public that get wide adoption. For us, the goal is mobility through an app. If you looked 4 or 5 years ago when Facebook first went public, most of their revenue and most of their eyeballs were from people using Facebook on their desktops. And the big concern was, will they be able to survive because everyone's clearly moving to mobile? And if you look today, the vast majority of their eyeballs and traffic comes from mobile users. And thinking about that 10 years ago, that's just not a business you could have created. One, there wasn't the penetration of smartphones. There wasn't the reliability of wireless carriers across a broad group. And people just didn't think they could rely on it. Today, if we tried to build a business that wasn't mobile first, that was enabled by the phone, we wouldn't be competitive in any market. So for us, we're focused on connecting individual riders to drivers at the push of a button. It's a two-sided marketplace, which means a rider who wants to get a ride needs to be able to request it and have a variety of options 24/7, 365. And a driver who wants to work part-time or full-time whenever they want needs to be able to have that choice and see that there's demand in the marketplace so they can make money in their free time. So there's a natural virality that occurs when you get a large base of users, such that whenever a driver wants to drive in a given area, there's going to be demand. That results in more drivers wanting to drive, which over time makes the average ETA in a city go down, which means more people are able to rely on Uber. And so it's a virtuous cycle, but it only works if we can guarantee that reliability. Trip history is a term we use internally for individual users or drivers. So for example, my trip history is I've done over 1,000 trips over the last 3 or 4 years and prior to joining Uber. And my average rating as a rider is 4.8. If you want to know your rating as a rider, you go to the help section inside your app and click a few times and it'll let you know. If you're 4.8 or above, that means you're no issues with your drivers, you're usually on time. You consider that a good rating. 4.7 to 4.8, very solid, but there's a good chance you're making your drivers wait a lot. Before 4.7, below 4.7, there's like a 20% chance you may be a sociopath, so just make sure that you're on time and polite to your drivers, and we'll make sure that they do the same to you. But for our company's trip history, the number we look at is 2 billion trips. So we've connected individual riders to drivers successfully over 2 billion times in our history. The crazy thing about this stat is that the first billion, it took us a little over 5 years to do. The next billion happened in less than 6 months. And so that's the pace of growth we're seeing all around the world, especially in Asia, in Latin America, in parts of Africa, even in Europe, which, from an economic perspective is a slower growing market, but we're seeing pretty broad adoption there. And we're continuing to see really strong growth in some of our biggest markets in the US, some of the markets that we've been in for 4 or 5, almost 6 years, your San Franciscos, your New Yorks, your Chicagos. So when we think about mobility on demand, we think about penetration and availability to people in different states or countries. So in the US today, 3 out of 4 Americans can get an Uber in under 10 minutes. If you go to major markets, large cities, tier 1 and tier 2 cities, that number is closer to 95%. How does it work? For those of you who haven't used it, which I was pleased to see is a pretty small number, but you open your app, you see who the closest driver is, you see what the wait time is, you can request whichever choice you want. So if you want the cheapest option, that's probably somebody who's nearby, you know, a neighbor or somebody who's in the area that's driving their Corolla or their Camry. If you want to step above the everyday, you can use Uber Select, which would be a higher rated driver in a nicer car. And if you wanted a professional limo driver in a black car, an SUV, you could use Uber Black or Uber SUV. So you request the ride. The driver who's closest has the ability to accept that ride. They don't have to, but because they're usually driving to make extra money, they have a natural incentive to accept that ride. The second that they do that, you see their name pop up on your screen, their rating, the make and model of their car, and their license plate number. And you see that driver driving towards you, and you can confirm that they're arriving under the estimated time that was quoted. And at the end of the ride, you'll get a receipt that tells you exactly what you paid, who your driver was, a map of your trip, and then the breakdown of your fare. And you have the ability to rate your rider either through your receipt that you get via email or directly in your app. And so the two-way rating system is something that people don't really appreciate as much because we look at ratings and everything we do via the web. But in this case, it creates a strong incentive for good behavior on both parts. Riders want to be able to continue to use Uber, and so if there's an altercation or something happens, if somebody's been drinking too much and harasses or abuses their driver, then those are, in some cases, we will remove those people from the platform. And similarly, if a driver does something that doesn't meet the community guidelines that we set for the platform, then we can remove the driver from the platform at any time. And so doing that two-way rating system, one, creates an incentive for drivers to make sure they provide high quality service, because if those ratings don't stay high, then we stop partnering with those drivers. They can stop partnering with us at any time for any reason, and similarly, we can do the same. But obviously, we have an incentive to make sure that there are as many drivers available in cities as possible with demand growing. But the drivers who aren't meeting that same level of service, it's not the right thing for the platform or riders who are relying on the platform to have any service providers who have lower quality ratings to stick around. So the safety features are something that I think are important to note that people who use Uber a lot sort of take for granted, but if you go back a few years and you were going to use a taxi or a limo service, there isn't the same accountability that technology allows today. So not just seeing who the driver is and their photo and the details of the car they're driving and their rating and being able to confirm their license plate, being able to confirm that the face you see in the app, an individual who was screened up front, who has valid insurance, who's covered by our insurance, and who has relevant documents in order to drive in that city and meet that city's requirements, you can confirm that that's who it is. But similarly, you can share your ride in real time with your friends or loved ones, so you can literally press a button in the app while you're on a trip to share your ETA, and it'll send a text message to whoever you choose from your contacts to say, Jenny wants to share her trip with you. They can click on a link and they'll see your ride on a map in real time, and when you arrive at your destination, they'll get a notification that says Jenny's arrived. So it's very popular with parents who have college kids, husbands and wives who want to make sure that their significant other is heading in the direction they should be heading. And there's a variety of things like that we do to make sure that there's accountability. One of those is anonymized phone numbers. So if you ever need to contact your driver, or your driver needs to contact you, when you hit contact driver and call through the app, when you call them, they don't see your phone number. And when they call you, you don't see their actual phone number. It's an anonymized number that we use. So once your trip ends, usually about 5 or 10 minutes after your trip, you won't be able to call that driver back. If you call that number, it's going to go to a general sort of Uber, an Uber line that doesn't get a response. And we want to make sure that you only are contacting your driver and vice versa for anything related to getting a ride. And so that again is a way to make sure that people aren't using the platform for any means other than making sure riders get where they're going safely. We have 24/7 GPS tracking, which is, again, something that's easily enabled by wireless technology and the fact that you can use the gyroscope in your phone and other aspects of your phone to see exactly where somebody is. And if the person isn't online in the app, then the transaction can't happen. So if people are using Uber to give rides, they have to be online. If they have to be online, we can see in real time from a GPS perspective where they are. And that means if there's a situation where the police want to investigate something and they talk to individuals that may have information, and somebody says, these two people got to this party, I saw them get out of an Uber, and the police want to put together a fact pattern, they can come to us, and we usually, if there's the relevant legal means, we'll provide that trip data, and they can track, to the second or minute exactly where the trip started and ended, if there were any stops. And so that kind of information, working with local law enforcement, has been something that has been very helpful for those cities where we work closely with police, but also for us to build that relationship with police associations and police officers so that they see the value that our driver partners are providing in the city rather than seeing it as a nuisance that they have to deal with. So a good example of safety in action, a tragic one unfortunately, was the Dallas shooting that happened in early July. So we have, as I mentioned earlier, we have operations teams in cities across the country. And our Dallas office for Uber is actually about a few blocks from where the shooting happened. So our general manager and two of our operations team members were actually in the office when it happened. Downtown was essentially on lockdown. And the three of them, myself, and a few other people from our trust and safety team were basically awake all night, coordinating with the city of Dallas to make sure that we could get people out of downtown safely. Having these relationships with cities allows us to help in situations like this. So in Dallas, the DART was shut down, and we were able to send drivers to the stops where DART trains stopped running so that people had rides home. We gave out free rides for the whole night for anybody who was trapped in downtown. We coordinated with the city and police to make sure that if they didn't want us communicating these free rides, if they wanted people to stay inside, that we weren't publicly saying that. And then when they were ready to say, we want to get people home, instead of us announcing it, actually the public information officer for the city of Dallas announced it via social media to say, Uber's giving free rides if you need help getting out of downtown. And so in those types of situations, we really want to be partners to the city. Nobody needed a promo code. Dynamic pricing was turned off. The goal was just how can we help people get home safely, and how can we do it in a way where we don't get in the middle of it. You probably didn't see very many stories about that because we don't view these as PR opportunities. If we want to be in every city in the world, we've got to be willing to be a partner to that city and just do the right thing. And in many cases, doing that is being helpful and staying out of the way. So this was an example that ended up getting a little bit of publicity on social media just because people were following what was happening in real time. But, we want to be able to be in a situation where whether it's a major event or an unforeseen crisis that we can help. And, this is one that happened pretty recently that I was very involved in. Road safety is something that if you talk to TxDOT or a bunch of state or local agencies, they're constantly focused on getting more data and making sure they can do things to nudge better behavior that lowers traffic, deters congestion, and in particular makes accidents less likely. And so for us, given that there are more and more drivers on the road using our platform to make money, one of the easy ways to contribute is collecting that information and sharing it with drivers so they can get daily or weekly reports saying, we noticed that you got a complaint from a rider about harsh braking, and we also noticed from your trip data that had happened several times. And the driver can see that and improve, and they can see their ratings improve. Reminding drivers about taking a break, letting the driver see within their app, the gyroscope on their phone can essentially tell them, here's how fast you're going. So if they're not looking at their speedometer, they'll see a red bar at the top of their phone that says, you're going 81 miles an hour. And we've done lots of statistical analysis to show that when drivers see that versus not seeing that, it actually affects their behavior. So we're not telling them to do anything, we're just giving them the information, and they naturally choose to modulate their behavior to say, oh, I'm going probably a little faster than I should. So from our perspective, this creates clear benefits for cities because it creates so many benefits for riders and drivers. The biggest one is just the safety and the reliability. So knowing that you can count on it 24/7, 365, and knowing that there's that accountability, the trips are being tracked in real time, that if there's an issue, you can get support 24/7, we found is very important to riders. The economic opportunities for drivers, in Houston, we've noticed that a significant percentage of drivers that have signed up to drive in the city over the last couple of years have come from the oil and gas industry, people who either had their hours cut or lost jobs. And if you're an individual that has a lot of experience in oil and gas, and it's hard to find another job in the local economy, a lot of people are saying, well, while I'm looking, I'm going to make extra money driving with Uber. And for our business, regardless of what's happening in the local economy, because we're just seeing so much growth and adoption, the demand isn't really tied to local GDP growth. And so we're constantly looking for more qualified drivers. And so we're seeing a lot of people come from that industry. Congestion relief is something we haven't made a lot of progress in Houston on. I'll be honest about that. Uber Pool is a product that we've launched in a lot of large cities that helps us address this issue. So you can actually you can share a ride with somebody else and won't take you more than 2 or 3 minutes out of your way. So you'll get matched based on where you're leaving and where you're heading. So the driver picks you up or picks somebody else up, makes a stop on the way, you get in the car, whoever's destination's first gets dropped off first, and the next driver gets dropped off. And we sometimes will see these Uber Pool chains where a driver will do this continuously for 8 or 9 or 10 riders during morning rush hour or during busy periods. And so in that situation, not only are you taking cars off the road with UberX or normal Uber alternatives or normal Uber options where a driver might do 10, 20 trips in a day, and those are all people who didn't have to drive or rent a car. But when you do with Uber Pool, you actually compound that impact because you can take even more cars off the road. And so in some of our largest markets where we've had Uber Pool now for well over a year or two, we're seeing that the majority of trips, in some cases, millions of trips annually are coming primarily just from Uber Pool, and that's become one of the largest sources of growth because it's so much more affordable. It's usually half the price of UberX, which in the case of Houston is about 50% of the cost of a taxi. So if we had Uber Pool in Houston in the future, you would be paying roughly a quarter of the cost of a taxi to get to whichever location you want to get to in the city. Enhanced tourism is something that the network effect has created, is that people land in an airport in another city and they expect to use Uber. They don't plan to rent a car. They're not having people pick them up. They expect that they can get an Uber to the airport and they can get an Uber getting picked up from the airport. So one of the things we're doing more and more now is working closely with airports to say, X% of your total airport traffic is actually people using Uber. So can we work with you to optimize the pickup and drop off? For those of you who travel, which I'm sure is a large number, I'm sure that you have seen that certain airports you get in and you get out. At other airports you've got to cross a bridge or a tunnel to get to where your car is. And so we're working with those cities to make sure that they realize if their goal is to make airport travel seamless, then they've got to integrate with other sort of mobility options to make sure that they can do that end to end. And then from a driver safety perspective, if you look at other jobs that involve driving, when we compare that to our platform, we see more than 10x the percentage of women drivers. And a large reason for that is the safety and accountability. People can choose where they drive, when they drive, how long they drive. It's a cashless system, and so people don't have to carry cash and worry about being a target. And that control for the driver allows a lot more people to opt into doing this because there aren't shifts, there aren't set hours. So I've met, in particular, women drivers, some of whom say, I prefer to drive early in the morning or rush hour, but I won't drive later at night because, I'm more likely to get somebody who's been drinking and it's just a hassle for me. I've met women drivers who said the opposite. One in particular that I know pretty well, her name's Elisa. Her kids are in college and she's a single mom. And so she mentioned that her daughter is using Uber in another city to get home from the bar safely. So she makes it a point to drive when the bars are closing because she wants to make sure she delivers that service for somebody else's kid. So our penetration today is over 70 cities, over 70 countries, 500 cities, over 1 million drivers on the platform globally, and tens of millions of active riders across the world. So how did that happen? These are a variety of factors that we think are relevant, but it's hard to say that one is more important than the other. Technology was obviously a big driver of it. Making sure that the back end works. You know, we call it the 4 nines, 99.99% of the time, so that you can achieve the 24/7, 365 reliability is a huge driver. We sometimes joke with our design team that they have done such a good job making the app simple and elegant that people don't actually think about or appreciate everything that has to happen on the back end, so that you always have a short ETA and you can get where you're going. But the technology and the product side is a big driver of that. The other side of that equation are the operations team we have on the ground. So we were just talking about this backstage, but it's not an accident that if there's a big event, more drivers are out, or that if it's late at night, you can still get a car, or early in the morning. We're able to flex the supply of qualified drivers because we have this larger pool of folks who are largely part-time. But the way we're able to do it is we'll communicate with them in advance that Halloween weekend is going to be really busy, or last year when Beyonce came to town, we saw 4x the demand we normally see on a Thursday night, or here's what you could earn based on historical patterns, or in some cases even giving incentives to say, if you drive at these times, we'll guarantee you can make at least this much money. And looking at the data over and over on a daily, weekly, hourly basis allows us to communicate that more effectively to them, and then the drivers have the information to say, is it worth my while to drive different hours this week or to drive more hours this week? The first mover advantage is something that I think was important in our market, but what's interesting is we only had it in part of the market. So we were the first sort of on-demand mobility app, but we started focused on black cars in San Francisco. We noticed there was this issue with limo drivers where they would do an early morning pickup, and then they'd sit around all day at the airport, and then they'd wait to pick somebody up at the airport late in the afternoon. So you had all this dead time that wasn't being utilized, where they could have been making more money, and people who didn't have easy access to rides could get it. And so that's where Uber started. It was primarily black car, and we weren't the first ones to operate in the peer-to-peer world where somebody can use their own car and drive part-time. One of our competitors started doing that first, and our concern originally was, is this going to be kosher from a regulatory perspective? And what we noticed is, as some of these other companies started doing this, cities weren't really taking action to say you can't. And at that point we said, all right, well there's a pretty large opportunity here that we already have a technology platform to address, and so we moved into what we call peer-to-peer, and that's what you know as UberX or UberXL. And so in that market we weren't actually the first mover, but the scale advantages of having the reliability and operating and quickly expanding to lots of cities allowed us to build that network effect. And addressing the pain points like lack of reliability, having to call in advance to schedule a ride, having to wait, making that on-demand and reliable address that pain point at a price point where people started to change their behavior. When I was living in New York 3 years ago. My wife and I had a baby and were looking to move back home, but my background was in technology and investing, and so Houston wasn't an obvious place to look. But one of the things that brought me here was that Uber has these operations teams on the ground, and when I was interviewing for the role, and they said, look, here are what the teams do locally, and they really are the CEOs of their cities, the first question that I asked was, the only way that that is true is if you have decentralized decision making, so you've got to have a common purpose and like values that organize how the company operates, but you've got to empower teams locally to do the right thing to grow the business. And if that isn't happening, then I don't see how both of those things can be true. And so, as I went through the interview process and talked to people who had been Uber from the early days, it was something that's very clear that our founder and CEO was very focused on making sure that those teams could focus on growth in their cities and were empowered to do that. And that's something that we actually think is a competitive advantage because it allows us to move more quickly. It puts a lot of pressure on your hiring because you've got to make sure that if you are going to be more decentralized, that you're hiring people that are operating the same way that we want the company to operate globally. But you've got to trust those people. And then the last one is obviously being ambitious but being risk tolerant. And what we've seen in our market time and time again is if you build the right solution and the market says this is working and consumers want it, then usually cities or regulators will change their point of view and say, okay, instead of going from here's how it's worked historically and why aren't you doing it the same way, they will eventually change their view to, okay, this is working, how can we regulate you for the business you're in rather than somebody else's business? And those are things that we think help us build a platform. Again, I mentioned earlier, it's a two-sided marketplace. In many cases, we think we're closer to eBay than we are to your local taxi company, because we're connecting a rider and a driver. And so we're facilitating that transaction. We've got the platform that does it. We facilitate the payment on the platform. And so doing that, convenience is something that obviously is driving the rider's behavior. Access is something that's driving the rider's behavior. They've got to be able to make sure they can always get a ride so that they don't have to plan ahead. Innovating with the business model in terms of the options. In many cities, we've rolled out upfront pricing. So we got the feedback from riders that sometimes if there's dynamic pricing and it says 1.4x, I really need to get somewhere, Uber's reliable enough where I'll pay 1.4x, but don't make me do the math to figure out what 1.4x is, or make me compare against other options. And so we have enough data now through the 2 billion trips that we've done where we can actually say, okay, if you're going from here to there, factoring in traffic, factoring what the distance is, like we can say with a really high confidence interval that here's what your price is going to be, and then we guarantee that price. So if we don't have the data science right, we'll actually lose money on those trips. But if we do have it right, we give that certainty to the rider up front, and it's a competitive advantage for us. Utilization, you can't have a network effect if the network isn't being used a lot, but then you've got to address the peak load issues that I'm sure you guys are all familiar with. I talked a little bit earlier about technology plus execution. Our chief security officer came from Facebook. He was at the Department of Justice before that. And I was talking to him about what he's noticed across the different tech companies he's worked at. And he said that most companies, he said, have sort of, are like kind of a one-headed monster. He said at Facebook, if you were an engineer, you were a demigod, and everybody else was a peon. And at Uber, we really don't have that model. It's, you know, we've got the engineering and product team, but if you have a great product and you have poor execution and bad local operations, it doesn't matter. If you have great local operations but not a good product or reliable engineering, it doesn't matter. And so we've actually built our organization such that both sides of the business are equally empowered, and that one can't basically say, hey, this is the product, you guys need to just figure out a way to make it work. And similarly, the ops team can't just say, build whatever we want without making sure that it can be reliable 24/7. So when you do all of that, it brings us to one of our cultural values, which is making magic. And what we mean by that is, you know, when people start using the platform, the first time I used Uber, I was in Harlem, in New York. It was late at night, a restaurant had closed. I was eating there with a friend of mine who used to be a professional basketball player. So we got a 6'10" Nigerian guy and a 5'10" Indian guy in Harlem in the middle of the night, too far to walk to the subway. Very well known in New York, the taxis just don't come to Harlem. And so I was actually thinking, are we going to just walk to Midtown, or like what's the plan here? I guess, you know, I'm with somebody who's 6'10", so worst case, if we're not in a safe, you know, if we're not in a safe area, I've got a little bit of intimidation factor. And my friend said, well, why don't we just use Uber? This was 2010 or 2011. And I'd heard about the company, followed it when it launched in San Francisco, but just hadn't occurred to me. And so 3 minutes later, somebody picks us up in a Lincoln Town car and drops him off, drops me off. Didn't care that we were in Harlem, didn't care that he was a 6'10" black guy, didn't care that I was a 5'10" Indian guy, didn't care where we were going or where we were from. It was that person was driving in that area to make extra money in a neighborhood they were familiar with, and it just worked. And so the first time I had that experience, I said, you know, it felt like magic. Usually when you use Google or you use Facebook or you use most other web-enabled platforms, it's primarily web-focused. So something's happening virtually and it's happening really well, but it's only happening online. There's not a lot of companies where you push a button and something happens in the real world and it happens the way you want it to regularly. The best example I can think of is probably Amazon has done a great job of making that happen. And so the first time I experienced that, it felt like magic. But to the point earlier, and I think you guys can all relate to this, the more people know it's reliable and expect that it's reliable, that magic goes away. So how do you make people feel like it continues to be magical? And for us, it's using the platform to deliver experiences that are not the day-to-day experiences. So when we had the Final Four in Houston earlier this year, we had a three-point shootout on demand with Kenny Smith, who was a Rockets great and had been involved with the NCAA tournament and had been involved in three-point shooting contests. So we literally had one of the best-known gyms in Houston set up like an NBA three-point shootout, and you could just press a button in your app, you get connected with the rider, you're going to compete with Kenny Smith head-to-head in a three-point contest. We've had transformers on demand, so that truck you see, we actually got that, and somebody was able to send that car to his house. He was at work, he sent it to his house where his 5-year-old was, and literally sent his son a transformer. We've done puppies on demand. The first time we did puppies on demand in Houston, we had more than 10,000 requests for puppies in 3 hours. I was there taking the puppies. I was one of the people on the ops team going with the drivers to deliver these puppies to offices. So you could get you get 2 or 3 puppies in your office for 15 minutes, play with them, and then it's like $25 and then we donate that to the SPCA, for example. I literally saw grown men cry when we did this. So, you know, we then did the variant of kittens on demand, saw some very interesting differences between puppy lovers and kitten lovers that we can talk about at another time. We do Uber ice cream every year in the summer, and that we do it globally. So in different countries, in different cities, different types of ice cream, but on the same day, you open your Uber app, you get ice cream delivered to you in the middle of the summer. We did Uber Chopper in Dallas for a major college football playoff game, and to our surprise, it was on SportsCenter that night. We've done campaigns with Mothers Against Drunk Driving, the Pledge to Protect campaign, so they're one of our national partners. Reducing DUIs is something that we're really proud of helping to achieve. And so there are a bunch of campaigns like this that we can do that keep riders engaged and help them, and they don't see Uber as just something that they can use to get to and from work or to the airport, but they can rely on it to do other things from time to time. So didn't plan it this way, but it worked out well that today in Houston, we're doing flu shots on demand from 11 to 3. So if you need a flu shot and you're stepping out for lunch, open your app and you might be able to get somebody here and you'll get a professional nurse. You know, it's like we're partnering with a separate company that like specializes in this across the US. And you'll get a nurse, a driver will bring you a nurse with care packages and free flu shots for 5 people. And then we're thinking about convenience in a different way. So it's great if you can deliver a car to somebody in 5 minutes or less. But if you can deliver a car in 5 minutes, there's probably a bunch of other things you can deliver in 5 minutes. So we're piloting with Walmart same day or same hour delivery. We're working with transit agencies on the first mile, last mile problem. So today in San Francisco, more than 15% of our trips start or end at a BART station. You know, we talked earlier about being ambitious and risk tolerant. You know, I think it's fair to say that we're an ambitious company, but we aren't so ambitious or arrogant to think that we can address transportation challenges on our own. And a big part of it is working with transit agencies to actually expand the pie of transportation options to address the needs of the city. So we worked with many cities where they actually track the data of the trips that we do, and they compare it to to before we came into the markets. What they see, which they in many cases didn't always realize, is that there is a lot of latent unmet transportation demand, and especially in cities that are very car dependent, people are just used to getting around with cars, and we don't question that in many cases it's inconvenient or takes extra time to find parking or have to valet, or if you're at the airport to park and then take a shuttle to the airport. So when you remove that friction from the process, people actually start thinking about what's most convenient rather than immediately going to their car, and that helps us address congestion and traffic. And I talked about Uber Health earlier. One of the best examples of this is Uber Eats. If you haven't downloaded Uber Eats, I highly suggest that you do. Not because I work at Uber, but just I don't. When people ask me, "Hey, I noticed you don't really drink or smoke," I said, "Yeah, when I was younger, my dad said I couldn't have 3 vices, and so the 2 I picked were gambling and fatty foods." And so Uber Eats in Houston has really solved that problem in an interesting way, where if you're in a meeting or you want to get lunch delivered to your door, or if your office manager wants to order lunch on demand for a larger group of people, we've got hundreds of restaurants across the city. Our average delivery time is less than half what most of our competitors do, And we already have the logistics infrastructure to make sure that it runs well. And then we have a separate app that allows you to see pictures of what you're ordering, see the price up front, order it, and then when the driver leaves the restaurant, you actually see that car coming towards you. So you get the notification when the food comes, but you can also see it coming towards you in real time. So in following our mission of transportation as reliable as running water everywhere for everyone, one of the things that was inherent is that we had to challenge the status quo, but it was primarily because in certain markets, the historical kind of taxi and limo interests weren't that thrilled about having a new competitor that was operating under a different type of business model that they hadn't seen before. And so in many cases we were responding to those groups saying Uber shouldn't be here or they should be regulated differently. But as we continue to grow, we've seen second order implications throughout the markets where we're challenging the status quo that we didn't originally set out to challenge. So we weren't trying to make a dent in car rentals, but if you have really consistent reliability from to and from airports, people are going to rent cars less. From a work on demand perspective, we're starting to see more and more people thinking about flex time and working either a second job or having their primary job have more flexibility. So, as much as we rely on the internet, in 2016, the vast majority of people are still going into an office from 9 to 5 or 8 to 5 to do their jobs, even though their jobs primarily involve using software and using the internet. So I think in 10 or 20 years, looking back at this year, we'll say it was silly or strange at the time that people who were partnering with Uber and scenarios like that were the only cases where somebody truly could set whichever hours they wanted. I think this type of flex time and work on demand, as we call it, is going to get more popular. Urban planning, cities are now able to see traffic flows and higher volumes of data around where there's congestion, why there's congestion, because we can provide that data to them in aggregate. And so in many cases, cities are working with us on transportation challenges. Hospitals are reaching out to us to work with us on helping seniors get to and from hospitals, because in many cases, it's cheaper for the hospital, and for seniors, it's easier for them to get to and from, not having to worry about driving or having to rely on somebody else to get them to and from the hospital, so it gives them more independence. We've moved into self-driving cars, which I'll talk about a little bit, and so we're partnering with auto manufacturers, but in some cases, auto manufacturers are competing with us. Food delivery, and then same-day delivery of other goods. And then an interesting one here is in the UK, there was an article that said that we were having a negative impact on the curry business. The people who were working in pubs and kind of Indian restaurants in the UK were leaving those jobs to drive with Uber because it was better money and better flexibility, and so it was harder for those businesses to actually make sure that they could meet. They were having a supply-demand problem where there's the same demand for curry but not the same supply of workers, and people were making other choices. So a lot of downstream effects that you wouldn't think about. So as we look to the future, one thing we're trying to do is really focus on innovating within the business that we have. We're looking at other business opportunities, but we need to continue to execute really well on our core business. I think that's something that's probably a similar area of focus for many of the companies that you are all with. And so within that core business, we're thinking about addressing use cases that we haven't addressed as well. So, our goal had always been, if it's transportation that's on demand, that's reliable, you don't need to schedule a ride. Just open your app and request it and a driver will come. But the feedback that we got, especially from older drivers older riders or people who weren't as familiar with Uber was, I know that you trust it, and my kids tell me that I should trust it, but I would rather just have the certainty that this has been scheduled. And so eventually we said, all right, let's just offer that to people and see how it works. And so what we've noticed is that in cities with larger suburban populations or greater sprawl, where the average ETA is not as low as it might be in a Chicago or New York, that a lot of people are using the schedule a ride option. And so that's something that we just recently rolled out. Uber Central is something we've heard about from a lot of businesses that we partner with, hotels, restaurants, folks that are planning conferences to say, can I just have a concierge essentially that books rides to anybody that's coming to my event and it gets billed back to me. But I want to be able to request multiple rides, and I want it to be easy, and I don't want to create a hassle for the people that are doing it on my dime. And so Uber Central is essentially that. It's a concierge service where you can have anybody at a company or at a restaurant can use it for any of their guests, and they can have it directly billed back to them instead of going through some other means. One other thing we're doing in terms of the core product is working with other emerging technologies. So if you use Amazon Echo, or if you use an iWatch, or any of these other evolving kind of mobile technologies, we're trying to make sure Uber is integrated in that. So you may have seen the Amazon Echo commercials where there's a guy who gets dressed up to go to a football game. He's dressed up as a mascot, and then he loses his keys, and then he says, and then he basically asks, the Echo to call him an Uber. You can do that through your iWatch now. One thing we're testing is basically using the app to make it easier for riders to find drivers in big events. So you could have a situation where a driver has a custom color that shows up on their car, and that's the color you see in the app. So if there's multiple Ubers nearby, you can say, that's the one that's mine, that you can see it easier, instead of having to look right at the license plate, and then as you approach the car, you can confirm that it's the right driver. There's stuff we're trying to do within the trip experience, so whether that's you being able to create your own playlist, or have one that's customized for you, you be able to get information or deals about the restaurants you're going to, or a hotel that's nearby. But all of that is contingent on the users wanting it, and it being a value-added experience, and doing it in a way that isn't intrusive. And so that's something that we're starting to think about. Mapping the world is what we call it internally, which is just getting, when you do all of these, when you're enabling access to all of these trips, you're getting a lot of data about where people, the length of these trips, which roads are easier, improving sort of traffic patterns, getting people from point A to point B more efficiently. And so what we started doing is actually doing our own mapping to get that data, to make it even better, so that the data science that allows you to get where you want to go quickly and efficiently and a reliable price continues to get better. So there's an example there of, at the top you see in Houston, certain areas that trips start and end, and then kind of a few hot spots there. And then autonomous vehicles is something that's obviously gotten a lot of attention this year. We've got a division of the company that we call our Advanced Technology Center that's based both in Pittsburgh and Silicon Valley, that focuses just on autonomous vehicles, and got dozens of people that have essentially dedicated their lives to this technology, that are the best engineers in that field. We recently acquired a company called Otto that is working on this for trucking, so long-haul trucking. And there's a screenshot there of a video about Otto, but I actually have seen videos of people in these trucks on highways. They're sitting in the front with the driver, and then the driver disengages, and they both get out of the front seats, and they're just sitting in the middle of the truck, and the car just continues to go, and it's just going straight, and you're just going straight, and you're in an 18-wheeler that's going 75 miles an hour on a highway that's driving itself. So a lot of really interesting stuff that's still being worked on, but has a lot of implications for traffic, for logistics, and the biggest one for us with autonomous vehicles is you've got over 1 million people a year who are dying in car accidents, many of which are due to human error. And so there's a big opportunity to just make transportation safer. We launched that recently in Pittsburgh. And so if you, as a user, opt in to get a self-driving vehicle, one will, and it's available, you'll get picked up in one, or you're more likely to get picked up in one. And it looks like that. And you're in the car, there's a tablet in the back seat. You can see what the car is seeing. You can take a selfie inside the car if you want. But there's a safety driver today with the car. So the car is an autonomous mode, but the driver is there if he needs to, for whatever reason, kind of engage manual and drive themselves. And the safety drivers are typically engineers that are just looking at more data and getting information from the riders. So there's a lot of unique things in Pittsburgh with changes in elevation, bridges. There's something called the Pittsburgh left, where if there's traffic going two ways, that you actually defer to the person that needs to make a left in front of you. And so being able to program all of these things into the software, one of the things about Pittsburgh is it's got some of the best engineers in this space in the world because of Carnegie Mellon University and their excellence in robotics. But it also is a really interesting geography where if we can make this work well in Pittsburgh, we can make it work probably in a lot of cities. And so just to wrap up, as we're talking about autonomous vehicles, people are There's an article the other day that Airbus is looking into autonomous planes. Growing up, I watched the Jetsons, and we're starting to enter this age where the future isn't as far away as we thought. So if we're not over time, I'm happy to take a couple of questions.